I thought my parents were inviting me to a peace dinner to finally apologize for 12 months of relentless pressure. Instead, I walked into a staged ceremony featuring a stranger in a tailored suit and a marriage packet with my signature line already printed. They preached about family, duty, and respect. What they did not realize was that I had already found the one clause that would destroy them all before anyone ever said I do. My name is Maisie Stewart. I am 31 years old, and I live a life that is entirely, deliberately quiet. My apartment sits just outside the city limits of Briar Glen, Missouri, an unremarkable brick building where the neighbors keep to themselves and the rent is predictable. I drive a reliable sedan that I paid off completely 2 years ago. From Monday through Friday, I work as a contracts compliance analyst at Westmere Transit Solutions. It is a job built on reading the fine print, identifying liabilities, and ensuring that no one is caught off guard by a buried clause or a hidden loophole. I like the absolute certainty of it. A contract is a promise written in ink, governed by strict rules, and completely immune to emotional manipulation. To a normal family, my life would be considered stable, a quiet success, even. I am financially independent. I cause no trouble, and I ask for nothing. But to my parents, Elaine and Russ Stewart, my existence is a glaring, public failure. In their world, stability without high social status is just a polite word for stagnation. My mother, Elaine, treats life as a competitive sport where the only scoreboard that matters is the collective opinion of the Briar Glen Country Club set. She controls the atmosphere of any room she enters through a weaponized, suffocating sense of shame. Her disapproval is rarely a shout. It is a tightened jaw, a sharp sigh at the dinner table, a meticulously targeted comment about a friend's daughter who just married a pediatric surgeon or bought a second home. Elaine views my lack of a husband as a personal insult, a tragic flaw in her otherwise flawlessly curated image. To her, a woman in her early 30s with a quiet apartment and no diamond on her left hand is a social emergency that the town gossips dissect over afternoon tea. My father, Russ, employs a completely different brand of control. Where my mother uses pointed words to cut, my father uses sheer physical space to smother. He is a man of heavy silence and intimidating presence. He stands in doorways, crosses his arms, and simply waits for the room to bend to his gravity. He does not negotiate. He makes the final decisions. If Elaine is the prosecuting attorney constantly listing my faults, Russ is the stern judge who issues the unyielding verdict and shuts down any possibility of an appeal. Together, they have spent my entire adult life trying to mold me into a shape I refuse to take. Their recurring obsession with my marital status borders on the pathological. They do not care about love, and they certainly do not care about my personal happiness. It is entirely about social currency. A successful son-in-law is a trophy to be displayed, a financial asset to be leveraged, and a protective shield against the whispers of their affluent peers. I learned long ago to endure our mandatory family gatherings by detaching my mind from my body. The humiliations are always orchestrated with military precision. I clearly remember Thanksgiving 2 years ago, standing in my parents' sprawling, pristine kitchen as Elaine introduced me to a local district judge she was desperately trying to impress. She did not mention my recent promotion at the transit authority. Instead, she patted my arm with a sickeningly pitying smile and said, "This is our Maisie. Still single, still figuring things out. We are hoping she settles down soon, but you know how career girls get stuck in their lonely ways." At a summer barbecue the year before last, my father introduced me to a wealthy commercial developer by loudly joking across the patio that he was still paying the insurance on my life because no man had stepped up to take the financial burden off his hands. I paid my own insurance. I always had. But the actual truth did not fit their carefully constructed narrative of the helpless spinster daughter. I survived these encounters by minimizing my physical presence. I showed up, I nodded politely. I ate the catered food, and I left exactly when my familial duty had been fulfilled. I learned to recognize the exact rhythm of their disappointment and the highly predictable cadence of their manipulation. That is precisely why the phone call I received on a random Tuesday evening felt so deeply, fundamentally wrong. I had just finished washing my solitary dinner plate when my phone vibrated loudly on the granite counter. The caller identification flashed Elaine's name. I immediately braced myself for the usual demanding tone or the passive-aggressive inquiries about my weight, my hair, or my thoroughly unexciting weekend plans. Instead, her voice floated through the tiny speaker, buoyant and coated in a honeyed warmth that immediately made the fine hair on the back of my neck stand up in alarm. "Maisie, darling," she said. The term of endearment alone was a glaring red flag. She only called me darling when we were in public and she was performing for an important audience. "Your father and I were just talking in the study, and we realized it has been far too long since we really caught up. Just the three of us." I dried my hands slowly, pressing the cotton towel hard into my palms. "I saw you both 3 weeks ago for brunch. That was a rushed lunch, and you had to get back to the office," she dismissed breezily, ignoring the correction. "No, we want to do something proper, a reset night, this Friday. We want to make you a beautiful dinner, pour some incredibly good wine, and just honor you, celebrate you." I stopped moving. The word hung in the quiet air of my kitchen, heavy and completely out of context. Honor. My parents did not honor me. They tolerated me. They corrected my posture. And they used me as a cautionary tale for their friends' children. They never offered unprompted affection unless it was the opening bid in a high-stakes negotiation. "Celebrate what exactly?" I asked, forcing my tone to remain flat and neutral. "Just you, your hard work, your quiet independence. We know we can be terribly hard on you sometimes. Maisie, your father and I want to turn over a new leaf. Please say you will come." The apology was far too smooth, far too rehearsed. It completely lacked the jagged, uncomfortable edges of genuine remorse. But to refuse a direct olive branch would instantly invite a different kind of war. One where they could play the devastated victims of a cold, ungrateful daughter. "All right," I said cautiously, my eyes scanning the empty apartment. "What time on Friday?" 7 in the evening, she replied instantly, without needing to consult a schedule. Then, the artificial warmth in her voice tightened into something sharper, something far more focused. "Oh, and Maisie, wear something nice. Not those dreary gray slacks you always wear to the office. Maybe that navy silk dress? The one that looks so elegant and formal." "It is just dinner at the house," I pointed out, my suspicion spiking. "Humor your mother. I am setting the good table." We hung up. I stood perfectly still in my quiet kitchen, the silence suddenly feeling thick and deeply suffocating. Something massive was shifting beneath the surface of my remarkably boring life. My mother actively caring about my wardrobe for a casual family dinner was entirely abnormal. But what bothered me infinitely more was my father. During the short phone call with my mother, my phone had vibrated twice with silent notifications. I checked the glowing screen. They were text messages from Russ Stewart. The first message read, "Make sure you are here by 7 sharp. Do not be late." The second message arrived exactly 2 minutes later. "Bring your current driver license. I need to check the renewal date against the auto policy file." I stared blindly at the illuminated screen. I had handled my own automobile policy for nearly a decade. Russ Stewart had zero legitimate need to see my government identification. Furthermore, my father absolutely despised texting. He viewed it as a weak medium for teenagers and subordinate employees. If he wanted something, he called and demanded it with his booming voice. 2 text messages in a matter of minutes, coordinating my exact arrival time and aggressively requesting legal documentation, felt exactly like the logistical coordination of a trap. They were carefully aligning their stories. My mother was managing the emotional staging and the visual aesthetics, ensuring I looked highly presentable. My father was handling the strict administrative lockdown, ensuring I arrived on a rigid schedule with my legal identity in hand. A reset night. A night to honor me. In my daily line of work at Westmere Transit, I am paid to look for anomalies. When a trusted vendor suddenly changes their corporate billing address, or when a subcontractor submits a perfectly rounded invoice out of nowhere, it is never an innocent accident. It is always a symptom of a larger, carefully hidden architecture. The exact same rule applies to human beings. When aggressively disappointed parents suddenly morph into an accommodating, affectionate unit asking for formal wear and legal identification, they are not turning over a new leaf, they are closing a net. I sat down heavily at my small dining table, pulling my phone closer to my chest. I did not know what they were planning in that sprawling house of theirs. I only knew that my mother's cheerfulness was a well-tailored costume, and my father's administrative requests were the turning gears of a mechanism. I opened the digital notes application on my phone. The cursor blinked steadily against the stark white screen. A tiny, glowing beacon of rationality in a sudden, overwhelming sea of dread. I slowly typed out a new heading. Friday dash, just in case I did not know what the case would be yet. But I knew with absolute certainty that I was walking into a room where the doors were about to lock from the outside. I closed the application, set the phone face down on the cool wood, and began to think not like an obedient daughter going to a family dinner, but exactly like a compliance analyst preparing for a hostile audit. Wednesday afternoon, exactly 2 days before the scheduled dinner, I was sitting at my desk reviewing a heavy stack of vendor compliance addendums. The fluorescent lights of the Westmere Transit office hummed a steady, monotonous tune above my head. I had a highlighter in my right hand and a red pen in my left, systematically hunting for liability loopholes in a municipal transport contract. It was meticulous, grounding work. It required my complete focus, which was exactly what I needed to stop thinking about the bizarrely cheerful phone call with my mother the night before. Then, my personal mobile phone vibrated violently against the cheap veneer of my desk. I glanced at the screen, annoyed by the interruption, but the irritation instantly evaporated when I saw the caller identification. It was my cousin Rhea Dalton. Rhea is a senior forensic accountant for a regional logistics firm. She is fiercely pragmatic, fiercely private, and entirely immune to the theatrical drama that infects the rest of our extended family. More importantly, she respects boundaries. We communicate via brief text messages on major holidays or family birthdays. A phone call from Rhea at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday was not just highly unusual. It was the equivalent of a blaring fire alarm. I dropped my red pen, picked up the phone, and answered in a hushed voice. Rhea did not bother with a greeting. Her voice was clipped, tight, and moving at a rapid pace. She asked me immediately if I was sitting in a private room. I stood up, walked quickly down the carpeted hallway to a vacant executive conference room, shut the heavy glass door, and threw the deadbolt. I told her I was alone. Rhea took a sharp breath. She told me she had spent her lunch hour at the upscale salon downtown, getting a quick trim before a client presentation. My mother, Elaine, had been seated 2 stations away, receiving an expensive gloss treatment. Elaine had not noticed Rhea sitting behind a stack of styling magazines, but Rhea had heard every single word Elaine projected across the room to her favorite stylist. My mother had been bragging loudly, holding court the way she always did. But the subject matter was entirely new. Elaine had announced to the entire salon that she was solving my future in one single night. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the conference room window, looking out at the gray parking lot. I told Rhea it was just my mother spinning another grandiose, pathetic narrative for her audience. I said she was always trying to invent a version of my life that sounded more glamorous to her country club friends. Rhea cut me off sharply. She said this was not a vague boast. Elaine had named a specific man. There was going to be a guest at the Friday dinner. His name was Gavin Mercer. A cold spike of adrenaline hit the base of my neck. I knew exactly who Gavin Mercer was. Anyone who paid attention to the local business journals in Briar Glen knew his name. He was 39 years old, a highly aggressive commercial property investor known for buying up distressed industrial zones and flipping them into luxury mixed-use developments. He had perfectly polished veneers, tailored suits that cost more than my car, and deep strategic connections at City Hall. He was a shark swimming in a bespoke pond. He was also completely out of my social and professional orbit. I asked Rhea why a man like Gavin Mercer would be sitting at my parents' dining table. Rhea lowered her voice, the urgency bleeding through the speaker. She said the dinner was not a blind date. It was a closing ceremony. Elaine had openly boasted to the stylist that an officiant was already booked for Friday evening. She had bragged that the legal paperwork was pre-prepared, so there would be no messy hesitation or cold feet. Elaine had literally said they were skipping the drama of a courtship and moving straight to the ink. I let out a short, hollow laugh that contained absolutely no humor. I told Rhea the entire concept was legally absurd. A marriage requires a license, a waiting period, and mutual, uncoerced consent. I told her they could not ambush me into a binding legal contract over roasted chicken. I was a compliance analyst. I knew how the law functioned. Rhea did not laugh with me. Her tone turned dead serious. She told me I was looking at the situation like a daughter, but I needed to look at it like an auditor. Then, she dropped the heaviest piece of the puzzle. She revealed that my father, Russ, was drowning. Through her accounting network, Rhea had heard rumors about my father's latest business venture. Russ had aggressively over-leveraged his company to buy a massive, dilapidated warehouse district on the south side of the river. The redevelopment deal had stalled completely due to zoning disputes and toxic soil remediation costs. My father had quietly missed 3 consecutive bridge loan payments. The bank was preparing to call the entire note due. He was staring down the barrel of total financial ruin and a very public, humiliating bankruptcy. Then, Rhea repeated the exact sentence she had heard Elaine say in the salon. My mother had laughed, waved her manicured hand, and said that once Maisie marries Gavin, everything aligns perfectly. The debt, the title, the reputation. The words echoed in the quiet conference room. The debt, the title, the reputation. I stopped breathing. The disparate, confusing pieces of the past 24 hours violently slammed together. Gavin Mercer was a commercial developer who specialized in acquiring distressed properties. My father owned a distressed property he could no longer afford. Gavin wanted the warehouse district. My father needed someone to assume his massive debt and save his pride. But why involve me? Why a marriage? Because in a straight corporate buyout, Gavin would have to pay fair market value or negotiate with the aggressive lenders. But a marriage changes the legal landscape. If Gavin married me, and my parents structured the warehouse transfer as a wedding gift or a familial asset consolidation, they could bypass standard commercial tax penalties. More terrifyingly, they could attach my pristine credit score and my clean legal name to the toxic debt, using me as a human shield to absorb the liability while Gavin took control of the physical asset. I felt a wave of nausea hit my stomach. I argued with Rhea, my voice cracking. I told her it was too insane, even for my parents. Coordinating a fraudulent, forced wedding to execute a real estate bailout was too extreme. They were manipulative, yes, but they were not criminal masterminds. Rhea stayed silent for a long moment. Then, my phone chimed against my ear. A text message had just come through from her number. Rhea explained that after she left the salon, she drove directly to my parents' house under the pretense of returning a silver serving tray she had borrowed for Thanksgiving. Elaine had let her in, distracted by a floral delivery. Rhea had walked past the formal dining room. The good table was already set. Exactly as my mother had promised me. Rhea had taken her phone out and snapped a photograph before slipping out the front door. I pulled the phone away from my ear and opened the image. The photograph was slightly blurry, taken in obvious haste, but the subject was crystal clear. It was a close-up of a thick, cream-colored cardstock place card resting against a polished crystal water goblet. The calligraphy was sharp, black, and perfectly centered. It read, Mr. and Mrs. Gavin Mercer. Right beside it, resting on the adjacent porcelain plate, was another identical card. It simply read, Maisie. I stared at the glowing screen until my vision blurred. The denial completely shattered, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. This was never about a reset night. This was never about honoring me or celebrating my independence. This was not even a misguided, old-fashioned attempt at matchmaking. This was a highly structured arrangement built entirely around leverage. I was not a guest at this dinner. I was the collateral. They were going to lock me in a room with a predatory investor, a hired official, and a stack of pre-prepared documents. And they were going to use every ounce of psychological terror they possessed to break me down until I signed my name on the dotted line. They expected me to freeze. They expected me to fold under the weight of my father's silent rage and my mother's weaponized shame. I put the phone back to my ear. My hand was shaking, but my jaw was set so hard my teeth ached. Rhea spoke one final time, her voice a fierce, protective command. She told me not to walk in there blind. She told me to treat this like a hostile takeover. I thanked her, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper, and ended the call. I stood in the empty conference room, surrounded by the quiet hum of corporate safety, and looked at the digital clock on the wall. It was nearly 3 in the afternoon. The dinner was scheduled for 7 in the evening on Friday. I had less than 48 hours to prepare a counteroffensive. I arrived back at my apartment precisely at 6 in the evening. I did not bother turning on the overhead lights or unpacking my work bag. I walked straight to the small desk in the corner of my living room, opened my personal laptop, and typed in a complex 16-character password. I bypassed my standard files and navigated deep into a hidden directory, opening a heavily encrypted folder labeled simply as Household Expenses. Nobody knew this digital vault existed. I had started building it nearly 2 years ago, driven by a quiet, desperate need to preserve my own sanity. Living in the gravitational pull of my parents meant constantly questioning my own memory. They were masters of revisionist history. If my mother delivered a crushing insult about my weight or my career, she would deny it entirely the next morning, claiming I was being overly sensitive or hallucinating insults that never happened. If my father made a veiled threat about cutting off contact with my extended family, he would later insist I had completely misunderstood his tone. The gaslighting had been so relentless, so seamlessly executed, that I had started keeping a meticulous paper trail just to prove to myself that I was not losing my mind. The folder was categorized by month and year. It contained hundreds of carefully logged items. There were screenshots of rapidly deleted text messages. There were exact transcripts of unhinged voicemails, typed out word for word. I had calendar entries detailing specific, terrifying incidents. I had documented the exact date and time my father had physically blocked the front door of their house during an argument, trapping me in the hallway for 45 minutes until I agreed with his opinion on a local election. I had written down verbatim quotes of my mother threatening to initiate a social smearing campaign against me at my workplace if I did not attend a charity gala she was chairing. It was an archive of systematic coercion. I had built it as a defense mechanism, a private reassurance. But sitting in the dark glow of my screen, armed with the terrifying context of my cousin Rhea's warning, I realized this folder was no longer just an emotional diary. It was an evidentiary database. I opened the search bar within the folder and typed in 3 words: identification, license, and social. The results populated instantly, cascading down the screen in a chilling timeline. I clicked through the archived text messages, watching a clear, undeniable pattern emerge. 7 months ago, my father had texted me asking for a high-resolution photograph of my driver license, claiming he needed it to update the tax family file for his accountant. 4 months ago, my mother had requested a copy of my passport, citing a sudden need to overhaul her life insurance beneficiary updates. 2 months ago, there was another request for my social security number, allegedly to verify a legacy bond my grandfather had supposedly left in my name. At the time, I had dragged my feet, asked questions, and eventually provided partial information just to stop the relentless phone calls. I had assumed it was just their usual administrative overreach, their desperate need to keep me entangled in their paperwork. I opened a new browser tab and immediately logged into my credit monitoring portal. The dashboard loaded slowly. I clicked over to the alerts section, scanning the recent history. There it was, exactly 3 weeks ago. My score had dropped by a few points due to a hard credit inquiry. When the email alert had originally arrived, I had dismissed it, assuming it was an automated glitch tied to the recent renewal of my apartment lease. Now, I clicked on the detailed report. The inquiry had not come from my property management company. It had been initiated by a commercial lending group based out of Chicago, an entity that specialized in high-risk bridge loans for corporate real estate developers. I had never done business with them in my life. I had never even visited Chicago. My chest tightened, a cold knot forming right beneath my ribs. I switched over to my archived email account. I used the search function to filter messages sent by my mother containing attachments. I scrolled past the endless forwarded recipes and the digital invitations to country club luncheons until I found a specific email from late February. The subject line read, "Oops, forwarded the wrong recipe. Please delete." I had ignored it at the time, assuming it was exactly what she claimed. Now, my hands felt numb as I double-clicked the attached portable document format file. The document filled my screen. It was not a recipe. It was a draft asset disclosure form. The top section was mostly blank, but the middle section was meticulously filled out. It listed my exact legal name, my current address, and my date of birth. Below that, under a section labeled Liquid Assets, it listed the exact name of my banking institution, the routing number, and the precise balance of my primary savings account down to the last cent. I shoved my chair back from the desk, the legs scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. The air in the apartment suddenly felt too thin to breathe. This was not a dinner. This was not even a forced engagement. This was a highly orchestrated, premeditated identity theft happening within my own family. They were not just trying to pressure me into a marriage to fix a social image. They had already used my personal financial data to set up the architecture of a massive loan assumption. They needed my physical signature on Friday night to finalize a fraud they had been quietly building for months. I picked up my phone, my fingers flying across the keypad. I did not call my cousin Ria again. I needed someone entirely removed from the family dynamic. I needed someone who dealt in facts, liability, and consequences. I called Tessa Monroe. Tessa and I had been friends since our first year of university. She was currently a senior litigation support specialist at a boutique private law firm downtown. She spent her days organizing discovery files for brutal corporate lawsuits, analyzing subpoenaed financial records, and helping trial attorneys build airtight timelines. She was the most unsentimental, sharply logical person I knew. She answered on the second ring, her voice brisk, with the faint sound of typing in the background. I did not bother saying hello. I started talking, my voice shaking slightly as I laid out the entire sequence of events. I told her about the suspiciously polite dinner invitation. I told her about the place cards my cousin had photographed. I told her about my father's failing warehouse development and the commercial developer who was suddenly joining us for a family meal. Then, I told her about the hard credit inquiry, the archived requests for my identification, and the draft asset disclosure form I had just found sitting in my deleted emails. I expected Tessa to gasp. I expected her to offer sympathy, or tell me how horrible my parents were. She did neither of those things. The typing in the background stopped completely. When Tessa spoke, her voice was low, slow, and completely stripped of emotion. She told me to stop pacing and listen to her very carefully. She said I needed to immediately stop viewing this as a toxic family drama. She reframed the entire situation with cold, surgical precision. She stated that my parents were not just being manipulative, they were actively engaged in statutory coercion and unauthorized data use. She explained that they were setting up a high-pressure environment to force a signature on a binding legal instrument. By bringing in a third party like the property investor and an official witness like the officiant, they were attempting to create a facade of mutual consent to legitimize a fraudulent financial transaction. Tessa warned me that if I signed anything in that room, untangling the legal liability later would cost me tens of thousands of dollars in attorney fees and could permanently destroy my credit profile. She said emotional courage was completely useless right now. I did not need to be brave. I needed to be legally and administratively prepared. I asked her what I was supposed to do. I asked if I should just block their numbers, lock my door, and refuse to show up on Friday. Tessa was quiet for a long moment. Then she said that avoiding the dinner would only delay the inevitable. If they already had my routing numbers and my social security data, they would find another way to force the issue, or worse, forge my signature electronically. She told me the only way to kill a trap of this magnitude was to walk directly into it, fully armed with evidence, and dismantle it in front of their witnesses. We stayed on the phone for another 2 hours. Tessa dictated a strict, methodical list of instructions, speaking with the authority of a battlefield commander. When the call finally ended, the dread in my stomach had completely vanished, replaced by a freezing, hyper-focused calm. I pulled my small laser printer out from under the desk and plugged the cable directly into my laptop. I opened the household expenses directory. I selected the screenshots of the identification requests, the bank inquiry notification, and the fraudulent asset disclosure form. I hit the print command. The machine hummed to life, methodically spitting out page after page of warm paper. Every single sheet was a physical manifestation of their betrayal. While the printer worked, I walked into my bedroom and dug through the bottom drawer of my nightstand. I found an old, deactivated mobile phone I had kept for emergencies. I plugged it into a wall charger, watching the battery icon slowly blink to life. I would use it strictly as an audio recording device, keeping my primary phone free for communication. I gathered the printed pages, neatly aligning the edges. The trap was set for Friday evening. They thought they were luring a terrified, compliant daughter into a room to sign her life away. They were incredibly mistaken. I would show up exactly at 7 o'clock, wearing the elegant dress my mother demanded. But I would not be arriving empty-handed. Thursday morning began before the sun even crested the horizon. My dining table, usually empty save for a single coffee mug, was completely transformed into a makeshift war room. Tessa arrived at my apartment at 6:30 in the morning, right before she had to commute to her downtown law firm. She brought a stack of heavy-duty manila legal jackets, a label maker, and a thermos of black coffee. We did not waste time exchanging pleasantries. We went straight to work, dividing the freshly printed pages into 3 highly specific, legally categorized files. The physical act of sorting the evidence was intensely surreal. I was indexing my own family's psychological abuse as if preparing for a corporate tribunal. The first manila folder was labeled Coercion Timeline. Into this jacket, we placed every printed text message, every transcribed voicemail, and every calendar entry documenting the sustained campaign of intimidation, physical door blocking, and threats of social smearing. The second folder, marked Unauthorized Data Use, was thinner but infinitely more dangerous. It held the draft asset disclosure form I had discovered in my deleted emails, neatly clipped to the printed report showing the hard credit inquiry from the Chicago Lending Group. The third folder remained completely empty. The label on its tab simply read, Anticipated Event Documentation. That jacket was reserved for whatever fraudulent contracts or marital agreements they planned to slide across the dining table on Friday night. By 8 o'clock in the morning, Tessa left for her office, and I formally requested a personal day from the transit authority. I could not sit under fluorescent office lights pretending to care about municipal bus contracts when my own identity was under siege. I sat down at my laptop and initiated a scorched earth defense protocol on my financial profile. I contacted the fraud departments of all 3 major credit bureaus. I submitted a formal identity theft alert and instituted a hard security freeze across my entire financial history. It took nearly 2 hours of navigating automated phone trees and speaking with risk management representatives. When I was finished, my credit was entirely locked. No new accounts could be opened, no bridge loans could be assumed, and no background checks could be processed without a multi-factor authentication code sent directly to my personal device. I locked the digital doors and threw away the key. At noon, I drove downtown to a free legal aid clinic located on the first floor of a brutalist concrete building. I had to wait an hour in a room smelling of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner just to get 15 minutes with a duty attorney. She was a tired-looking woman with sharp, unblinking eyes and a desk buried under manila envelopes. I presented a carefully sanitized, hypothetical scenario about a forced legal signature and physical intimidation in a private residence. She did not sugarcoat the reality of the legal system. She told me that attempting to prove duress after a document is already signed is an incredibly expensive, agonizingly slow process. Her advice was absolute and uncompromising. She told me not to sign a single piece of paper. Regardless of the pressure applied, she explained the strict legal definition of false imprisonment and unlawful restraint. She explicitly instructed me that if someone physically blocks an exit, I must vocalize my non-consent loudly, clearly, and repeatedly, removing any ambiguity about my desire to leave the premises. While I was driving back to my apartment, Tessa called my primary phone. She had spent her lunch break utilizing her network of paralegals and law enforcement contacts. She had managed to reach a dispatcher at the county sheriff's non-emergency line. Tessa could not guarantee a patrol car would sit idling in my parents' driveway just based on a suspicion, but she successfully logged a potential civil standby concern for their exact address. They established a documented call path on the public record. We agreed on a specific, predetermined keyword. If I texted Tessa the word sunflower, she would immediately trigger a priority dispatch, informing the authorities that a domestic restraint situation was actively escalating and I was being held against my will. It was not a magical shield that would instantly manifest a police officer, but it created an undeniable official timeline. Back in the quiet safety of my apartment, I turned my attention to the technology. Our fictional jurisdiction operates under a strict one-party consent law for audio recordings. This meant that as long as I was an active participant in the conversation, I could legally record the audio without informing anyone else in the room. I took the old, deactivated backup phone I had charged the night before and cleared its internal memory completely. I opened the voice memo application and tested the microphone sensitivity. I hid the device deep inside the inner zippered compartment of my heavy leather handbag, ensuring the microphone was positioned near the thin fabric lining for maximum audio capture. I walked around my living room, speaking at a normal conversational volume, and played the audio back. The sound was crisp and undeniable. Next, I opened my primary mobile phone and drafted a text message addressed to my own email inbox and to Tessa's secure number. The message simply stated the exact time and a declaration that I was departing the premises. I left the draft open. I planned to hit send the exact second I crossed the threshold of my parents' house. Generating a third-party, digitally verified timestamp of my exit. Late Thursday evening, Tessa called one final time. She sounded quietly triumphant. She had spent her evening running a deep background check on the hired official my mother had boasted about at the beauty salon. Through public municipal listings and regional wedding directories, Tessa had found his business profile. The man's name was Mr. Lowell Pike. He was in his early 60s, ran a highly legitimate officiant business, and possessed excellent client reviews. This was a massive, structural revelation. Tessa pointed out the crucial flaw in my parents' plan. A man with a legitimate business license, a public reputation, and municipal standing does not willingly risk his entire livelihood to participate in a fraudulent, forced marriage. My parents had almost certainly lied to him to secure his services. They likely framed the Friday dinner as a deeply private, fully consensual family ceremony to avoid any suspicion. This single piece of information shifted my entire strategy. Until that moment, I had been bracing myself for a violent, emotional screaming match with my father and a theatrical crying fit from my mother. I had anticipated a brutal family war. But Tessa's discovery illuminated a completely different path. Arguing with my parents was a trap. They thrived on emotional chaos. It was their home territory. If I cried, my mother would call me hysterical and unstable. If I yelled, my father would use it as an excuse to exert physical dominance and shut me down. I realized I did not need to fight my family at all. I only needed to address the outsiders in the room. Mr. Lowell Pike and Gavin Mercer were the weak links. They were external entities bound by professional liability, public reputation, and legal exposure. If I presented cold, undeniable facts and stated my lack of consent directly to them, bypassing my parents entirely, the machinery of the evening would violently collapse under the weight of its own legal risk. Friday arrived with a suffocating, atmospheric heaviness. By 5:30 in the evening, the sun was beginning to set, casting long gray shadows across my apartment floor. I stood in my bathroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror above the sink. I wore the dark navy silk dress my mother had specifically requested. The fabric was cold and smooth. It felt exactly like a costume, a bespoke suit of armor designed to blend flawlessly into their wealthy, curated aesthetic. I pulled my hair back tightly, securing it at the nape of my neck. I applied minimal makeup. I looked composed, fiercely professional, and entirely devoid of fear. I walked into the living room and picked up my heavy leather handbag. I felt the solid, reassuring weight of the 3 meticulously organized evidence folders and the 2 mobile phones resting inside. I returned to the mirror. I looked directly into my own eyes, forcing my shoulders to drop and my breathing to slow. I took a deep breath, letting a freezing, analytical calm settle deep into my bones. I practiced the exact words I would use, keeping my tone perfectly flat, projecting my voice from my diaphragm exactly the way the exhausted duty attorney had instructed. I do not consent. I am leaving now. Move. I repeated the script 3 times to the empty room. The words felt heavy and polished, like stones in my mouth. I did not sound like an obedient daughter, and I did not sound like a victim. I sounded like a liability. I turned off the bathroom light, locked my apartment door, and walked out to my car. I was ready for the reset night. I parked my car in my parents' expansive circular driveway at exactly 6:55 in the evening. The late autumn air was biting, but the cold did nothing to lower the temperature of my blood. I gripped the thick leather straps of my handbag, feeling the solid, reassuring weight of the 3 evidence folders and the active audio recording device hidden safely inside the interior lining. I walked up the winding brick path to the massive oak front door. I did not bother knocking. I turned the brass handle and stepped inside. The immediate sensory disconnect hit me before I even cleared the foyer. A dinner party has a very specific, undeniable architectural scent. It is supposed to smell of roasting meats, melted butter, simmering garlic, and the sharp tang of uncorked red wine. But the air inside the house was completely sterile, entirely devoid of any culinary warmth. Instead, it was suffocatingly thick with the heavy, cloying fragrance of white lilies and burning beeswax. It smelled exactly like a funeral parlor, attempting to mask the scent of decay with expensive floral arrangements. I walked slowly from the entryway into the main living space. The sprawling room had been meticulously, terrifyingly altered. The large, custom-made Persian rug that usually anchored the center of the floor had been rolled away. The heavy mahogany coffee table was gone. In their place, my mother had arranged two short, symmetrical rows of antique dining chairs. They were angled inward, creating a narrow, highly structured lane that pointed directly toward the grand stone fireplace. Thick, ivory pillar candles of varying heights were clustered along the mantelpiece, casting a flickering, theatrical glow across the empty wall. It was not a dining room. It was a makeshift, inescapable ceremony aisle. As soon as my heels clicked against the exposed hardwood floor, a man rose gracefully from one of the front row chairs. He wore a dark charcoal suit that screamed of bespoke tailoring and ruthless corporate aggression. His hair was perfectly styled, his jawline sharp, and his posture rigidly confident. He did not look at me with the nervous, hopeful gaze of a prospective suitor meeting a woman for the first time. He looked at me the way an executive surveys an acquisition target just before signing a hostile takeover bid. He stepped forward, closing the distance between us with smooth, practiced steps. He extended a manicured hand. He greeted me by my first name, his tone utterly familiar, as if we had already spent hours in preliminary negotiations and were simply reconvening after a brief recess. He smiled, a cold, calculated expression that did not reach his eyes, and told me it was wonderful to finally bring everything across the finish line tonight. I did not take his hand. I simply stared at it until he slowly lowered it back to his side, his polished smile hardening by a fraction of an inch. My eyes moved past him, scanning the shadows near the fireplace. Tucked into a heavy wing-back chair in the far corner sat an older gentleman in his early 60s. He wore a modest, slightly rumpled, dark suit that sharply contrasted with the predatory elegance of the man standing in front of me. The older man clutched a worn leather folio tightly to his chest. He looked politely uncomfortable, shifting his weight nervously, his eyes darting around the room with the distinct unease of a professional who suddenly realizes the job he was hired for is not exactly what it was advertised to be. Before I could speak, my mother descended upon me from the adjacent hallway. She was wearing a silver, floor-length cocktail gown that caught the candlelight in glittering flashes. She was practically vibrating with a manic, overperformed cheerfulness. She grabbed my elbows, her grip shockingly tight, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging sharply into the navy silk of my dress. She did not ask me how my day was. She did not welcome me to a family meal. She spoke in a breathless, theatrical cadence, projecting her voice so the men in the room could hear every artificially joyful syllable. She praised my punctuality, declaring that I looked absolutely stunning, and insisted that we needed to keep things moving because everyone was so incredibly eager to finalize the celebration. She buzzed around me, adjusting the collar of my dress, touching my hair, treating me exactly like a frantic, slightly delayed bride rather than a 31-year-old woman arriving for a Friday night dinner. A heavy, definitive sound echoed behind me. The massive oak front door swung shut, sealing the house tight. I did not need to turn around to know it was my father. I heard the distinct, metallic slide of the heavy brass deadbolt locking into the strike plate. I slowly looked over my shoulder. My father had taken a wide, planted stance directly in front of the entryway. He was not wearing a celebratory suit. He was wearing a dark sweater and slacks, looking entirely rigid. He crossed his thick arms over his chest. He did not step forward to join the bizarre gathering. He simply positioned his large frame between me and the only visible exit. He was the silent enforcer, guaranteeing that nobody would leave the room until his demands were met. My mother released my elbows and placed a guiding hand firmly against the middle of my back, physically pushing me forward. She did not guide me toward the dining room where the table was supposedly set. She steered me toward a small, antique writing desk that had been dragged out of my father's study and placed at the very end of the makeshift aisle. Under the sharp, concentrated beam of a brass reading lamp rested a thick stack of high-grade legal paper, neatly bound by a heavy black binder clip. My mother called it a simple family agreement packet. Her voice was bright, but her eyes were completely dead, locking onto mine with a silent, terrifying warning. She reached across the desk and slid a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen across the smooth wood. It rolled with a quiet rasp, stopping directly in front of the empty leather chair positioned at the desk. I looked down at the documents. The bright light illuminated the stark, black ink. My full legal name was typed across the header of the top page. Below it, a series of bolded subheadings marched down the paper like a firing squad. I saw the words marital agreement. I saw an entire section dedicated to post-marital residency requirements. I flipped the first page over with a single finger, exposing the dense paragraphs underneath. My eyes instantly caught the phrases asset consolidation, transfer of liability, and mutual assumption of existing commercial debt. It was a financial surrender document wrapped in the thin, fraudulent guise of matrimony. They had drafted an entire alternate reality where my autonomy, my credit, and my future were legally fused to a stranger to save my father from bankruptcy. The man in the charcoal suit stepped up beside the desk, invading my personal space. He did not lean in to whisper something romantic. He did not offer a single word about love, partnership, or even basic attraction. He spoke purely in the sterile, unyielding language of high-stakes corporate finance. He checked a heavy silver watch on his left wrist and stated that we needed to maintain efficiency tonight. He mentioned that the quarterly timelines were exceptionally tight, and that signing the schedules immediately would ensure maximum stability for the entire regional portfolio moving forward. He was treating my life like a distressed municipal asset that needed to be liquidated before the fiscal year ended. The sheer audacity of the setup was breathtaking. The candles, the flowers, the locked door, the hired officiant waiting in the corner. They had built a psychological pressure cooker, fully expecting me to shatter. They anticipated that the combined weight of my father's physical intimidation, my mother's social manipulation, and the polished aggression of a wealthy investor would force me to pick up the gold pen and sign my name just to escape the agonizing tension of the room. The primal instinct to turn around, scream, and fight my way past my father at the front door burned fiercely in my chest. But I did not move. I felt the steady, silent recording device capturing every single piece of evidence from the darkness of my handbag. I looked at the aggressive investor checking his watch. I looked at the hired officiant shifting uncomfortably in his chair, a man who clearly believed he was attending a consensual, private elopement. I looked down at the fraudulent, legally binding trap resting under the brass lamp. I reached out, grasped the back of the heavy wooden chair, and pulled it out. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the floorboards, cutting through my mother's artificial chatter. I smoothed the skirt of my navy dress and slowly sat down at the desk. I was not surrendering. I was taking my seat. I recognized with absolute clarity that this room was no longer a family home. It was a live, active crime scene, populated by multiple witnesses, and I had just taken the stand. I sat in the heavy wooden chair, the leather cool against my back, and stared at the gold-plated fountain pen resting on the dark wood of the desk. My mother took my silence for submission. She interpreted my calm demeanor as the final, successful breaking of my will. She stepped closer, her silver gown brushing against the side of my chair, and immediately launched into the script she had undoubtedly been rehearsing for weeks. Her voice lost the manic, party hostess pitch and dropped into a low, theatrical register meant to convey deep maternal burden. She began listing the invisible debts I supposedly owed them. She spoke of the endless sacrifices she and my father had made to provide me with a respectable foundation. She painted a tragic picture of her own suffering, detailing how exhausting it was to endure the pitying looks from her friends at the country club, the constant, humiliating questions about why her only child was still living alone in a mediocre apartment. She reached out and placed a warm, heavy hand on my shoulder, her fingers squeezed tight enough to bruise. She leaned down, her perfume suffocatingly thick, and whispered that the world was an incredibly dangerous place for an unprotected woman. She said that all they ever wanted was security for me, a real future, a shield against the harsh realities of life. From his position guarding the dead-bolted front door, my father broke his silence. His voice was a low, rumbling command that vibrated through the floorboards. He told me to stop stalling. He ordered me to pick up the pen, review the summary pages, and sign where the tabs were marked. I did not pick up the pen. Instead, I reached out and unfastened the heavy black binder clip holding the packet together. I spread the pages out flat under the concentrated beam of the brass reading lamp. I did not look at my mother, and I did not look at my father. I lifted my chin and locked eyes directly with Gavin Mercer. I kept my voice perfectly modulated, stripping away any trace of daughterly rebellion or emotional distress. I sounded exactly like a compliance analyst conducting a hostile audit on a fraudulent vendor. I asked Gavin who, specifically, had drafted the marital agreement and the attached property schedules. Gavin shifted his weight, clearly unsettled by my clinical tone. He smoothed the lapels of his charcoal suit and offered a polished, evasive smile. He replied that his private legal team had prepared the standard boilerplate documents to ensure maximum efficiency for everyone involved. I tapped my index finger against the third page. I asked him who had provided his legal team with my personal financial figures, my Social Security identification, and the exact liquid asset totals required to draft such specific schedules. The polished smile faltered slightly. Gavin glanced over my head toward my parents before looking back at me. He chose his words with the careful, slippery precision of a corporate shark trying to avoid a liability trap. He stated that all document preparation was based entirely on the preliminary understandings he had reached with my mother and father. He claimed they were functioning under the assumption of full familial transparency and mutual alignment. He had just admitted, aloud, in a room with witnesses, that the entire negotiation regarding my legal and financial future had occurred without my presence, without my input, and without my consent. I turned my attention back to the documents. I scanned the dense, legally binding text, completely ignoring the heavy sighs of irritation coming from my mother. I was hunting for the poison pills, and it did not take long to find them. I found the first one on page 5, buried deep within a section outlining post-marital lifestyle parameters. I did not keep the discovery to myself. I read the clause out loud, making sure I projected my voice clearly enough to reach the dark corner where Mr. Lowell Pike was sitting with his leather folio. I read that upon the execution of the agreement, the second party, which was explicitly defined as me, must tender her formal resignation from her current place of employment within 90 days. Furthermore, the clause mandated that I must immediately relocate my primary residence to an estate owned entirely by a limited liability company controlled by Gavin Mercer. It was a legally enforced isolation tactic. They were stripping me of my independent income and legally binding me to a property where I would have absolutely no ownership rights and no tenant protections. I would be entirely dependent, financially and physically captive. I flipped to page 7 and found the financial core of the trap. I read the next clause aloud, enunciating every single syllable. The document required the immediate voluntary contribution of a settlement reserve account to a joint holding trust. The contract listed the exact required contribution as $84,212.50. I paused, letting the exact number hang in the stifling air of the room. I looked directly at Gavin again. I informed him that the number printed on his contract was the exact balance of my private, single-signer savings account as of Tuesday morning. I asked him how his attorneys could possibly know the precise balance of a highly secure banking account without someone committing wire fraud or unauthorized digital access. Gavin took a sharp half-step backward. The business language completely evaporated from his tongue. He looked at my father, his jaw tight, realizing for the first time that I was not a terrified girl who was going to quietly sign her life away. I was actively building a verbal record of statutory coercion and financial crime. The soft, maternal facade my mother had been wearing instantly shattered. The velvet gloves came off, revealing the cold iron underneath. She slammed her palm down hard onto the antique desk, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot in the tense room. She abandoned the speeches about love and security. Her voice turned vicious and cutting. She told me to stop playing amateur lawyer and read the room. She openly declared that my stubbornness was pathetic and that I was destroying the only viable lifeline our family had left. She leaned in so close I could feel her furious breath against my cheek. She told me this was my absolute last chance to prove I was a daughter worth defending. She hissed that if I walked away from this table, I would be dead to them, permanently exiled, and stripped of everything they could possibly take from me. My father stepped away from the door, closing half the distance between us. His massive frame cast a dark shadow over the desk. He delivered a final, undeniable command. He told me to shut my mouth, pick up the pen, and sign the bottom line. The pressure in the room was absolute, a crushing physical weight designed to force submission. But they had miscalculated the fundamental geometry of the room. They thought the battle was between me and them. I ignored my father. I ignored my mother. I ignored the man in the bespoke suit who wanted to purchase my credit score. I slowly turned my wooden chair completely around. I bypassed the family warfare and focused entirely on the one person in the room who had something genuine to lose. I looked directly into the alarmed, wide eyes of the hired officiant sitting in the corner. Mr. Lowell Pike had stopped fidgeting. He was sitting completely rigid, his knuckles white as he gripped his leather folio. I kept my voice perfectly calm, entirely rational and devastatingly clear. Did anyone tell you I had not seen these documents until tonight? The silence that followed my question was absolute. It was not the contemplative quiet of a family trying to reach an understanding. It was the sharp, breathless vacuum of a room where a massive lie had just been dragged into the harsh light. All the calculated pressure my mother had been applying, all the physical intimidation my father had been projecting, suddenly hit a solid brick wall. The center of gravity in the room shifted violently. It moved away from the antique desk where I sat, bypassing my parents entirely, and landed squarely on the shoulders of the man sitting in the dark corner. Mr. Lowell Pike swallowed hard. The sound was audible over the quiet hiss of the burning beeswax candles. He looked down at the documents spread across the desk, then up at my mother, and finally, his gaze settled on me. His pale blue eyes were wide with a dawning, absolute horror. He was a man who had spent his career officiating joyous occasions, reading poetry, and signing marriage licenses in sunlit gardens. He had zero experience navigating a hostile, legally fraught confinement scenario. He cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice was thin and reedy, completely lacking the practiced resonance of a public speaker. He addressed me, but his words were meant as a desperate defense of his own professional integrity. He stated that he had absolutely no idea there was any dispute. He admitted, his voice trembling slightly, that Elaine had booked his services exactly 2 weeks ago. She had paid his premium weekend rate in cash. She had explicitly told him that both parties had fully consented and were profoundly in love. She had spun a convincing, romantic narrative about Gavin being a high-profile local figure who despised media attention. She had claimed that the two of us wanted a deeply private, immediate family ceremony to avoid the invasive glare of the local press and the high society gossip circles. She had assured him that the legal paperwork had already been reviewed and approved by my own private counsel. He looked at my mother with a mixture of betrayal and rising panic. He told her she had guaranteed him this was a joyous celebration. I did not give my mother the opportunity to interrupt and spin another lie. I needed to solidify the record for the audio recording device hidden inside my handbag. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap, and I delivered my statement with the clinical precision of a sworn deposition. I stated, clearly and unequivocally, that I did not consent to this marriage. I stated that I had never spoken a single word to Gavin Mercer before walking into this house 45 minutes ago. I stated that I had been lured to this address under the false pretense of a standard family dinner. Most importantly, I turned slightly and gestured toward the front entryway. I stated that the deadbolt had been secured the moment I stepped inside, and that my father had actively positioned himself to block my physical exit from the premises. The effect of my words on Mr. Pike was instantaneous. The passive professionalism completely vanished from his face, replaced by the acute alarm of a man who suddenly realizes he has walked into a trap. He snapped his heavy leather folio shut. The sharp, percussive sound of the leather slapping together cut through the heavy floral scent of the room like a physical blow. He planted his feet and stood halfway up from the wing-back chair, his posture hovering in an awkward, terrified crouch. My mother recognized the catastrophic loss of control. The most crucial piece of her machinery was attempting to flee. She immediately pivoted, trying to salvage the collapsing narrative by weaponizing her maternal authority. She let out a bright, brittle laugh that sounded entirely unhinged. She rushed toward Mr. Pike, her silver gown rustling aggressively against the hardwood floor. She waved her hand through the air, completely dismissing my statements as if they were the irrational ramblings of a toddler. She told him to please excuse my dramatics. She plastered a deeply sympathetic, patronizing smile on her face and claimed that I was simply overwhelmed. She called it classic bridal anxiety, a severe case of cold feet amplified by the stress of my demanding corporate job. She tried to reach out and touch his arm, assuring him that I was just highly emotional tonight, that I always got defensive when I was nervous, and that underneath the panic, I knew this was the absolute best thing for my future. She begged him to just give me 5 minutes to calm my nerves, promising that I would come to my senses and sign the papers exactly as we had all planned. I ignored my mother entirely. I kept my eyes locked onto the officiant. I asked Mr. Lowell Pike a direct, binary question. I asked him if, as an officer licensed by the state, he was comfortable proceeding with a legally binding ceremony after hearing one of the parties explicitly and repeatedly state their non-consent in front of multiple witnesses. He froze, his face draining of all color. He knew the legal definition of coercion. He knew the catastrophic liability he would absorb if he signed his name to that certificate now. Before he could formulate an answer, the entire facade of the evening cracked open from a different direction. Gavin Mercer finally lost his patience. The wealthy commercial property investor had spent the entire evening playing the role of the confident, polished suitor. But as he watched the hired officiant preparing to bolt, and realized that my signature was not going to materialize on the asset transfer schedules, his pristine corporate mask slipped completely. He was not a man driven by love, lust, or even a twisted desire for social status. He was a man driven purely by capital, and he was watching his investment collapse. He stepped aggressively toward the desk, pointing a sharp finger at the documents. He dropped the soft, persuasive tone entirely. His voice became harsh, rapid, and intensely irritated. He announced that we did not have time for this ridiculous psychological theater. He turned his anger toward my mother, blaming her for failing to secure my compliance before he arrived. Then, in his frustration, he made the fatal, irreversible slip. He stated that the county clerk office would open at exactly 8 o'clock on Monday morning. He revealed that there were strict filing deadlines tied to a massive title issue on a specific warehouse parcel. He growled that if the legal transfer of liability and the spousal asset consolidation were not notarized and submitted by the end of the current fiscal quarter, the tax penalties and the bridge loan defaults would trigger an automatic foreclosure, costing him hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost equity. The words hung in the air, a damning confession of absolute fraud. He had just confirmed every single suspicion I had brought into this house. This had absolutely nothing to do with family healing, establishing a stable future, or protecting my social reputation in a small town. It was a cold, calculated real estate bailout. The marriage was merely a necessary administrative vehicle to illegally shift a toxic commercial debt onto my clean financial profile, allowing Gavin to acquire my father's failing warehouse development free and clear of the crushing loan obligations. Mr. Pike gasped softly, clutching his folio to his chest like a physical shield. He finally understood the true nature of the gathering. It was not a wedding. It was a financial crime requiring a hostage. The atmosphere in the room plummeted from tense family drama into something distinctly dangerous. My father realized that the social manipulation had failed, and the financial motive had been entirely exposed. He abandoned all pretense of being a concerned parent. He shifted his heavy frame away from the door and took 3 slow, deliberate steps toward the center of the room. He did not look at me. He looked directly at the terrified officiant. My father's voice was a dark, menacing rumble. He did not ask. He commanded. He told Mr. Pike to sit back down in the chair, open his book, and finish the job he had been paid in cash to perform. He stated that nobody was leaving the room until the ink was dry on every single page of that packet. The command stripped away the final illusion of a civilized dispute. The living room instantly transformed into a space of active, physical confinement. The air felt dangerously thin. My father was no longer trying to convince me. He was relying on raw, physical intimidation to force compliance from both me and the hired witness. But coercion only works if the target believes they have no power. Mr. Lowell Pike looked at the massive man blocking his path. He looked at the aggressive investor glaring at his watch. And then he looked at me, sitting perfectly still at the desk, refusing to touch the gold pen. He found his moral courage not in bravery, but in absolute self-preserving terror. He stood up completely, his spine rigid. He did not yell, but his voice carried a startling, undeniable finality. I am not performing anything until she is free to walk out that door. The officiant's declaration hung in the air, a sudden, immovable barrier against my father's physical intimidation. While the 3 of them stood frozen in the wreckage of their broken authority, I turned my attention entirely back to the antique desk. I ignored the marital agreement clauses. I grabbed the thickest section of the packet, the portion hidden beneath a heavy cardstock divider. I flipped past page 10, past page 11, and stopped dead at page 12. The font changed drastically. It was no longer the elegant, spaced serif of family law. It was the dense, unyielding block text of commercial banking. I stared directly at a bridge loan guarantee. Below it was a deed of trust transfer for a commercial warehouse parcel located on the south side of the river. In the top right corner of the transfer document, a specific serial number caught the concentrated light of the brass reading lamp. Form Series 742 Alpha. My heart slammed against my ribs, but my hands remained perfectly steady. It was the exact alphanumeric sequence I had seen on the suspicious digital attachment my mother had accidentally forwarded to me back in February. The cold truth washed over me, chilling me to the bone, yet illuminating the entire room with horrifying clarity. This was not merely a preemptive contract. My parents had not just drafted an idea, they had already executed the preliminary stages of a massive financial fraud. They had used my stolen identification, my social security profile, and my pristine credit history to underwrite the initial stages of a commercial loan assumption. They had already submitted the digital paperwork to a lending group. The only thing missing to activate the trap was the physical, notarized ink on the final execution pages. I looked up at the man in the charcoal suit. The final piece of the architecture clicked into place. Gavin Mercer was not a prospective groom looking for a convenient tax shelter or a respectable local bride. He was the underwriter. He was the apex predator who had bought my father's collapsing debt for pennies on the dollar, and his non-negotiable condition for clearing the bankruptcy was complete legal control over my clean financial identity. He was using a marriage certificate as a corporate merger, laundering a toxic real estate failure through my personal credit. I placed my index finger firmly on the center paragraph of page 14. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute clarity of my words cut through the suffocating silence of the room like a scalpel. I read the header aloud: Spousal occupancy and co-liability assumptions. I continued reading the dense legal jargon, translating it into plain, devastating English for the terrified officiant to hear. The clause explicitly stated that by entering into the marital union, I was retroactively acknowledging and assuming full, unmitigated co-liability for the commercial warehouse debt. It was a poison pill designed to make it legally impossible for me to disentangle myself from the financial ruin. If I ever tried to file for a divorce or report the coercion after the fact, I would be legally chained to a multi-million-dollar default. My wages would be garnished, my assets seized, and my professional career in compliance completely destroyed. Gavin understood instantly that his insulation was gone. The moment I read the commercial debt clause aloud in front of a licensed state official, the situation escalated from a bizarre family dispute into a prosecutable federal wire fraud and coercion case. The polished, aggressive investor completely vanished, replaced by a coward desperate to avoid a grand jury subpoena. He took 2 rapid steps backward, physically distancing himself from the antique desk. He held his hands up, palms facing outward, a universal gesture of legal surrender. He turned his head and glared at my mother with absolute venom. He stated that this was an unmitigated disaster. He told Elaine that she had explicitly guaranteed him the target was fully informed and completely willing to assume the corporate structure. He threw her directly under the bus, loudly claiming he was completely unaware of the deception and would absolutely not be a party to an unconsented, fraudulent contract. My mother watched her savior violently sever the life raft. Total panic set into her features. Her carefully curated country club facade completely disintegrated. She lunged forward, not physically attacking me, but launching a desperate, vicious assault on my sanity. Her voice became shrill and trembling. She accused me of losing my mind. She screamed that I was deeply confused, hallucinating massive conspiracies out of standard family estate planning. She wildly claimed that I had been brainwashed. She shouted the names of my cousin and my best friend, declaring that Rhea and Tessa had poisoned my head with ridiculous, paranoid fantasies. She insisted, with tears of genuine terror forming in her eyes, that I was destroying my own life out of pure spite and psychological instability. But it was my father who delivered the final, fatal blow to their own defense. Russ Stewart had spent his entire life ruling through silent intimidation, deeply accustomed to people folding under his sheer physical presence. He was not a man built for complex legal maneuvering, and he was completely incapable of maintaining a lie when his dominance was challenged. Watching the deal of his lifetime collapse right in front of him broke his rigid discipline. His face flushed a dark, dangerous red. He stepped away from the door, his heavy hands balling into tight fists at his sides. He did not deny the fraud. He did not deny the coercion. Driven by pure, arrogant rage, he barked that I was an ungrateful, selfish child who possessed no concept of loyalty. He roared that he only needed one signature night to fix everything, to save the family name from public humiliation, and that I was too stupid to understand the sacrifice required of me. The heavy, ringing silence that followed his outburst was catastrophic. He had just confessed, out loud, in front of an active audio recording device and a terrified state-licensed witness. He had accidentally, but undeniably, confirmed the explicit intent to pressure a legal commitment through confinement and manipulation. The room began to vibrate with the fallout of his shouted confession. My mother was hyperventilating, her hands pulling frantically at the silver fabric of her gown. Gavin was actively calculating the fastest route past my father to reach his luxury sedan in the driveway. Mr. Pike was pressing his back so hard against the wall, it looked as though he was trying to phase through the plaster. I did not move from the chair. I kept my posture perfectly rigid, maintaining total control over my physical space. I slowly slid my left hand off the smooth wood of the desk and let it drop into the open compartment of my heavy leather handbag, resting on the floor beside my knee. I did not look down. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my mother's terrified, crumbling face. My fingers found the smooth glass screen of my primary mobile phone. I relied entirely on the muscle memory I had practiced all afternoon. I unlocked the screen by touch, opened the active messaging application, and pressed the exact sequence of letters on the digital keyboard. I typed the word sunflower. I maintained absolute eye contact with the woman who had tried to sell my future, and I pressed send. I withdrew my hand from the dark interior of my leather bag. The silent, digital distress signal was already flying through the cellular networks toward Tessa. Now, I needed to lock the final pieces of the trap into place. I planted my feet firmly on the hardwood floor and stood up from the antique desk. The sudden vertical movement forced my mother to take a startled step backward. I modulated my voice to strip away any trace of panic or daughterly submission. I spoke loudly, clearly, ensuring the microphone hidden in my purse caught every single syllable. I do not consent. I am attempting to leave. You are preventing me. I paused for exactly 2 seconds, letting the formal declaration carve itself into the acoustic reality of the room. I was no longer speaking to my family. I was speaking to the future attorneys, the police dispatchers, and the legal record. Mr. Lowell Pike had heard enough. The terrified officiant gripped his leather folio to his chest like a bulletproof vest and lunged out of the wingback chair. He scrambled toward the entryway, desperate to escape the toxic gravity of my family and the catastrophic liability expanding in the living room. But my father operated on pure instinct. Russ Stewart did not move out of malice in that specific fraction of a second. He moved out of a deeply ingrained habit of physical control. Whenever an argument in our house reached a breaking point, his default response was to seal the perimeter. As Mr. Pike approached the heavy oak door, my father simply shifted his massive frame sideways, stepping directly into the officiant's path. He did not raise his fists. He did not say a single word. He just stood there, an immovable wall of muscle and bone, physically blocking the only viable exit. It was a fatal tactical error. By blocking a licensed state official who was actively trying to flee, my father had just elevated a manipulative family dinner into a verifiable, multi-victim confinement situation. Gavin Mercer recognized the legal exposure unfolding in real time. His eyes darted from my father at the front door, and then snapped down to the illuminated desk. He realized that the highly incriminating commercial property schedules and the fraudulent bridge loan guarantee were still sitting completely exposed under the brass reading lamp. He lunged forward, reaching his manicured hand across the polished wood. He demanded the packet back, his voice cracking with rising panic. He told me the negotiation was over and ordered me to hand the documents over immediately. He knew that if those pages left the house, his entire corporate empire could be subjected to a federal audit. I moved faster. I slammed my palm down flat against the center of the paper stack, pinning the pages hard against the desk. The sharp slap of skin against paper echoed loudly in the quiet room. I leaned my entire weight into my arm, locking my elbow. I looked up at the wealthy investor, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, unwavering contempt. I told him no. I did not pull the packet toward my chest. I left it entirely visible, right in the center of the light, but completely inaccessible to him. I stated that the pages would remain exactly where they were. Gavin froze, his hand hovering mere inches from mine. He could not physically wrestle the papers away from me without committing a battery in front of a witness. He was trapped by his own desperate need to maintain a veneer of civilized corporate behavior. He pulled his hand back as if the paper had suddenly caught fire. From the corner of my eye, I watched my mother undergo a profound, horrifying transformation. Elaine Stewart was a master manipulator, highly attuned to the emotional frequencies of the people she abused. For the past hour, she had been waiting for my voice to shake. She had been waiting for the tears, the desperate pleading, the familiar, inevitable collapse of my personal boundaries. But as she watched me stare down a ruthless commercial developer without blinking, the realization finally struck her. She saw the perfectly ironed navy silk dress. She noticed the complete absence of emotional reasoning in my arguments. She heard the sterile, prosecutorial vocabulary I had been using since the moment I walked through the door. The truth hit her with physical force. I had not walked blindly into an ambush. I had arrived prepared for a deposition. My mother whispered that I knew. Her voice was entirely devoid of its previous theatrical rage. Her hands dropped limply to the sides of her expensive silver gown. She stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, repeating that I had known about the trap before I even drove to the house. Before I could confirm or deny her accusation, the silence of the room was violently shattered. From deep inside my leather handbag, a harsh, electronic buzzing erupted. It was a sustained, aggressive vibration that rattled against the hardwood floor. It stopped for a fraction of a second, and then my primary mobile phone began ringing at maximum volume. It was the sharp, piercing tone of an emergency override. Tessa was executing the next phase of the protocol. Having received my prearranged keyword and receiving no immediate follow-up message confirming my safety, she was triggering the escalating call tree. She was calling both of my devices simultaneously to create a verifiable, digital record of unresponsiveness. The noise was deafening in the tense, candlelit room. It sounded exactly like a security alarm counting down to 0. The sudden noise broke whatever remaining resolve Mr. Pike possessed. The officiant pressed his back hard against the wall near the locked front door, putting as much physical distance as possible between himself and my father. He raised his empty hands in the air, trembling violently. He shouted over the ringing phones that he had absolutely nothing to do with this scheme. His voice cracked with genuine terror. He looked directly at me, tears forming in the corners of his pale eyes, and swore that he had been completely misled. He loudly declared to the entire room that he would go on the public record. He promised that if the authorities asked, he would provide a full, sworn statement detailing every single event that had occurred in the house. He framed himself exactly as he was, a secondary victim of a massive, coordinated fraud. The mention of the authorities completely shattered Gavin Mercer's final shred of composure. The man who had confidently planned to leverage my financial identity just 40 minutes ago was now actively trying to erase his own existence from the narrative. He took 3 rapid steps backward, retreating from the desk until he bumped into one of the antique dining chairs arranged in the fake ceremony aisle. He held his hands up, mirroring the terrified posture of the officiant. He abandoned the marital agreement. He abandoned the commercial debt rescue. And most importantly, he abandoned my parents. Gavin stammered that he was just a guest. His polished corporate mask completely dissolved into an ugly, transparent display of cowardice. He looked wildly around the room, speaking to an invisible jury, claiming he had only been invited for a simple dinner. He reframed his presence, insisting he was merely attending a private family discussion and had absolutely no part in whatever internal dispute was escalating. It was a pathetic attempt at self-preservation. He was trying to verbally rewrite history, hoping that if he classified the kidnapping and the coercion as a simple family disagreement, he might somehow escape federal indictment. My mother stared at him, her mouth slightly open, watching the wealthy savior she had worshipped completely distance himself from their shared crime. The dominoes were falling rapidly. The unified front my parents had constructed had entirely collapsed into a room full of terrified individuals frantically trying to save themselves. My father was still standing by the door, his chest heaving, slowly realizing that his physical dominance had successfully trapped him inside a room with 3 people who were actively building a legal case against him. The buzzing from my handbag finally stopped, the ringing silenced. For one long, agonizing second, the room plunged back into a suffocating quiet, broken only by the frantic breathing of the men and women who had tried to steal my future. Then, the darkness outside the front window was suddenly pierced by a blinding, sweeping light. The heavy drapes covering the living room glass illuminated with the unmistakable, brilliant flash of high-intensity vehicle headlights pulling into the circular driveway. The bright beams swept across the manicured lawn, cutting fiercely through the shadows and casting stark, moving patterns across the interior walls of the house. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. The engine noise outside cut off abruptly. We heard the heavy, metallic thud of a car door slamming shut in the cold night air. Heavy footsteps crunched methodically up the brick walkway leading to the porch. And then, 3 hard, authoritative knocks struck the heavy oak wood of the front door. The sound reverberated through the silent house, heavy and absolute. It did not sound like a visitor arriving late to a party. It sounded exactly like a verdict. The heavy knocks resonated through the floorboards, shattering the tense paralysis of the room. My father, a man entirely unaccustomed to his authority being challenged in his own domain, instinctively took a half step away from the deadbolt. He did not have time to formulate a new strategy. A commanding voice penetrated the thick wood, identifying themselves as the county sheriff department and demanding immediate entry. The heavy brass lock turned with a sharp click. The heavy oak door swung inward, pushing my father back. 2 uniformed figures stepped over the threshold, bringing the freezing night air into the suffocating, floral heat of the living room. The lead deputy was a tall, weathered man with a utility belt and a heavy flashlight in his grip. The second was a younger local officer, his hand resting cautiously near his radio. Their eyes immediately swept the bizarre scene before them. They took in the rolled-away rug, the flickering pillar candles, the antique chairs lined up like church pews, and the 4 deeply panicked faces staring back at them. I did not wait for my parents to construct a lie. I stepped forward, cutting through the silence. I clearly stated my full name. I informed the deputies that I was the direct subject of the civil standby call generated earlier that afternoon. I pointed directly at my father and stated that I did not consent to being present. I had explicitly attempted to leave the premises, and that man had physically positioned himself to prevent my exit. My calm, procedural declaration severed the final thread of the trap. Mr. Lowell Pike saw the uniforms and recognized his absolute salvation. The terrified officiant practically lunged toward the open doorway. He shoved his leather folio under his arm, raised his hands, and began talking at a rapid, frantic pace. He identified himself as a licensed county officiant. He pointed a trembling finger at my mother, loudly stating that she had paid him in cash and explicitly assured him that both parties had fully consented to a private family ceremony. He declared that he had been entirely misled, that he had witnessed the coercion firsthand, and that he was leaving the premises immediately before his professional license was destroyed. The older deputy took one look at the panicked, sweating man in the rumpled suit and simply stepped aside. Mr. Pike bolted out the door and vanished into the dark driveway, sprinting toward his vehicle before a single vow could ever be spoken. With the independent witness gone, the officers immediately took control of the environment. The lead deputy ordered everyone to separate. He instructed my father to move away from the entryway and sit in the far corner of the room. He told Gavin Mercer to step entirely away from the antique desk. The living room, which had been meticulously staged as a romantic trap, instantly transformed into a documented crime scene. The ivory candles, the calligraphic place settings, the heavy gold pen, and the thick legal packet sitting in the center of the desk became undeniable visual evidence of premeditated intent. The older deputy approached me, pulling a small notepad from his breast pocket. I reached into my heavy leather handbag. I did not pull out a tissue. I pulled out the audio recording device, tapped the screen to stop the capture, and locked the file. Then, I handed the deputy the 2 manila folders Tessa and I had prepared that morning. I provided him with the detailed coercion timeline, the time-stamped exit messages, and the printed copies of the unauthorized credit inquiries. I informed him that the digital audio file contained a full, unedited hour of financial extortion and physical intimidation. While I spoke to the deputy, Gavin Mercer attempted to execute a silent retreat. The wealthy commercial developer casually buttoned his charcoal suit jacket and began edging his way toward the open front door, trying to project the aura of a busy executive who had simply stumbled into the wrong house. I stopped my sentence and pointed directly at the antique desk. I told the younger officer to look at the documents under the brass reading lamp. I stated that the man attempting to leave the room was trying to illegally attach my clean financial profile to a failing commercial bridge loan. The younger officer stepped forward, blocking Gavin's path. He pulled a digital camera from his utility belt and walked over to the desk. Before Gavin could even protest, the officer systematically photographed every single visible page of the marital agreement. He captured the spousal liability clauses, the required settlement contributions, and the attached property deeds linking the forced marriage directly to the collapsing warehouse development. Gavin stood frozen, watching his entire corporate insulation evaporate under the flash of a police camera. The collapse of their power structure broke my parents in entirely different ways. Elaine Stewart did not care about the legal exposure or the complete destruction of our relationship. She was standing near the front window, her hands pressed desperately against the glass, staring out at the street. The flashing blue and red emergency lights of the patrol cruisers were illuminating the manicured lawns of her wealthy neighbors. She began to spiral into a frantic, hyperventilating panic, muttering obsessively about her reputation, the country club whispers, and the absolute social ruin descending upon her. She was mourning her image, not her daughter. My father, however, was entirely silent. Russ Stewart sat heavily in the wingback chair, recently vacated by the officiant. The rage had drained completely out of his face, leaving behind a hollow, stunned expression. For his entire adult life, he had relied on physical intimidation to force the world to bend to his will. Now, surrounded by state authorities and undeniable forensic evidence, he realized his absolute lack of control. His physical dominance had failed spectacularly in front of sworn witnesses. The lead deputy finished reviewing the draft asset disclosure form I had provided. His expression hardened. He looked up from the paperwork and addressed me directly. He stated that the situation had escalated far beyond a domestic disturbance or a family dispute. The presence of my exact Social Security details on unauthorized commercial loan preliminary documents indicated a severe case of identity misuse and attempted financial fraud. He strongly advised me to take the police report number he was generating and immediately contact the Federal Financial Crimes Division first thing on Monday morning. The stakes had officially been raised from a toxic household dynamic to a prosecutable felony. I thanked the deputies for their time. I picked up my leather handbag, feeling the solid, victorious weight of the evidence inside. I did not look at Gavin. I did not look at my father sitting in the corner. I did not offer a final, dramatic parting word to my mother, who was still weeping over her lost social standing by the window. They were not worth another syllable of my breath. I turned my back on them and walked out the open front door, under my own power. The freezing night air hit my face, clean and incredibly sharp, erasing the suffocating stench of the lilies. I walked down the brick path with the officers present, leaving my parents trapped inside the exact cage they had spent months building for me. I reached my reliable, paid-off sedan. I unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and pressed the lock button. The heavy metallic thunk of the locks, engaging, severed my final tie to that house. For a long moment, I just sat there in the dark. The adrenaline that had sustained me for the past 48 hours suddenly vanished, leaving a massive vacuum in its wake. My hands began to shake violently against the smooth leather of the steering wheel. A ragged, tearing breath escaped my chest, followed by a sudden rush of tears. But I was not crying out of sorrow or grief. I was crying out of a fierce, blinding relief. As I stared at the flashing police lights illuminating the driveway, I realized the profound truth of the night. The real victory was not humiliating my family in front of a wealthy investor or a hired officiant. The true victory was the absolute unyielding refusal to let them sign my future away. I had defended my own life, and I had won. The epilogue to the night did not arrive until the following morning. I woke up late on Saturday in the quiet safety of my apartment. I reached for my phone and saw a single new voicemail notification. I pressed play, expecting an angry tirade from my father or a weeping apology from my mother. Instead, the voice echoing through the speaker belonged to Gavin Mercer. He did not call to apologize for attempting to purchase my identity. His voice was tight, terrified, and highly aggressive. He demanded that I return the printed legal packet he had left on the desk, claiming it contained proprietary corporate data that belonged exclusively to his holding company. He threatened legal action if I showed the attached schedules to a financial attorney. Listening to his desperate, panicked demands, a cold realization settled over me. The staged marriage trap was never the entire game. It was merely the opening move of a much larger, far more dangerous corporate scheme. And Gavin Mercer was absolutely terrified of what I was going to uncover next. Thank you so much for listening to this story tonight. Please drop a comment below and let me know where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts on this crazy situation. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Amelia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people out there.